Welcome, everyone, to Dark Loops Productions' Systems Gone Wild, a podcast for discussing wild systems theory. I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty. I'm a cognitive scientist philosopher at Illinois State University.
Hello, Professor Jordan. I am Gurpyari Bhatnagar, associated with Sharda University as Associate Professor of English Literature. I find theories, extremely fascinating, extremely intriguing. So as they allow us to, look at literature. So not just literature, but also life from newer perspectives. So I had this wonderful chance, to look at your theory, in newer perspectives, when you were invited at the inaugural talk, for the inaugural talk at our university.
Yes.
And now I'm here, with my students to understand, your theory more,
That's
your
very,
theory
very
better.
kind.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we first met at the Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson. Was that 2017?
I think that was 2018, if I'm not wrong.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. And we were commenting earlier, this is proof of the point. If you're going to be in academia, get out in the world, give talks, because you never know who's going to be in the audience. I mean, we're here today because we were at the same talk. I mean, there's so many papers out there that you're never going to read just because there's so many papers. But going into talks and letting yourself meet people you don't know, that's what I do with every sabbatical. I show up somewhere and I don't know many people, maybe one, and then I end up working with a bunch. So yeah, all right, I'll shut up. So students, please introduce yourselves and tell us a little something about what you do. And we'll start with Chirag.
Okay, hi Scott. My name is Chirag, and I'm currently pursuing my master's. And by side, I also love to write. I write content on boxing. That's my favorite sport, and I love literature. It's it's one of those things that has helped me throughout life. And the more I delve deep into it, I have fallen in love with theories, and I love that I have got this opportunity, to talk to somebody who has, such an interesting ideas about the, environment and the world and this philosophy. Looking forward to this.
Oh, that's very, very kind of you. Thank you so much. And Fatima.
Hello there. So
Yes.
my name is Fatima Zahra. I'm from Morocco. I did my minor and major in English studies back in Morocco in UCD University, and I had some jobs before I decided that I had to go back to finish my studies. So now I'm pursuing a master's degree in Sharda University. Other than that, I don't like talking about myself, but
no, it's all good. It's all good. I just want everybody who's watching to have a bit of a sense of.
Okay, but all I can say is that I'm a 90s kid, and that says all about me. We are the generation that has to be like a bridge between two different worlds, because I think the world is before 2000 is a lot different than after 2000. So we are the generation that has to tell the tale, but we have first to make sense of all that chaos. But
absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. I've often thought of the 21st century as the millennia of the trickster, in the sense that most worldviews have embodied the notion of chaos within a character they call a trickster god. And the trickster's in charge right now for sure. And so that'll be part of what we talk about with wild systems theory, right? Does it even provide us a way to be present in a world of chaos? And thank you so much for that. And
thank you.
Ishika.
Okay, so hi Scott. My name is Ishika, and I am a student currently at Sharda University. I'm pursuing masters in English, and besides that, I also write. I write about basically NFL. You must be familiar with the sport,
Yes,
and
yes, yeah.
yeah. So basically, I write about NFL, and I think it's like this is a really great opportunity for me because I'm going to use this theory to evaluate a work, right? So I
Mm.
don't think get this opportunity to talk to the person who created the theory himself. And I think I'm really glad that I got this opportunity.
Well, that's so terribly kind of you. Um, first of all, I love the fact that you all write. Currently working on a book that will be done someday. And the point of that book is to present wild systems theory as a framework that allows us to stop pretending, at least in the Western world, right? That science narratives, scientific narratives, and cultural narratives are different types of things. I mean, I would argue they have different constraints on what truth is, but it's when we start to treat science like it's non-narrative that we get we stick to a bifurcated worldview of meaning and science, and I'll go into that later. But I'm thrilled that you all write. In my 20s, or maybe it was my mid 30s, talking decades here, I did a lot of what people would call fiction writing myself. And the point of the fiction, I couldn't stop it from happening. And it just became clear that there were things in my life that I needed to own. There were things in my memory that I needed to have be mine, like an archaeologist. So I wrote them. It's all from my point of view, so it's not an exciting novel for anyone. But the idea of taking it out, putting it into words, and then bringing it back in, and that cycle was very important for me, and I would argue important for everyone. But I don't try to tell everyone else what they should do. So I'm thrilled that you're all here. So I think what we'll do is I've prepared some slides that will allow me to talk about wild systems theory. And as I do this, I'm going to have my slides on one screen and I'm going to have you guys on the one. So I want to be able to see both. Okay, so this is the talk I created before we had all of the logos in the thing. So I wasn't able to edit this. But as I said, as I go through this, please feel free to ask questions and then we'll take it from there. So our models of what we are and what we are living in necessarily contextualize and constrain our models of science and literature. That may sound like a lot of words. All it's trying to say is that our ability to generate thoughts about what we are and what we are in, those thoughts necessarily constrain anything we say about who we are and what we're in. Like Scott, obviously, what does that mean? So, for example, for a long time, there are still people who believe we're spirits in a material world. This is not for me. I'm not saying these things to be judgy. I'm just putting these out as examples of the kind of narratives we have about what we are and what we are in. So spirits in a material world, informational minds in a physical world. This is currently very popular. Strong AI it's started in the 1950s, but it's the argument that basically your mind will be able to be downloaded into non-biological material at some point. We think of ourselves as physical minds in the physical world. Now we're thinking of ourselves as quantum minds in a quantum world. These are just different examples of the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, what we are, and what we live in. And when I call these word stories, people in my discipline feel like I'm trivializing things, right? It's a story. It's not the truth. And that's the very form of thinking that wild systems was created to get around. So I'm going to propose that these models we have, information minds and physical worlds and such, these are models or stories and what I'll call wild narratives. They're narratives because they are about what we are and what we live in. So when I tell you that, when I ask the question, how does my physical brain produce consciousness? I'm telling you a story about what I believe I am, and I'm trying to describe how it works. And these narratives are wild because they emerge from the choices and chances of our lived lives. So just like any story is an emergent aspect of what you've lived, that includes what you've read, who you've met, what you've heard, what you've seen. And when I say these things about science, people get concerned, wait a minute, it's not choices and chance. Yet any scientist will tell you that what we do in experiments is we try to organize context so we can constrain the impact of chance as much as possible. But we're not getting rid of chance. We're not getting rid of chaos. We're just trying to manage it as best we can. And you can almost think of the history of science as the history of building tighter and tighter constraints until you have the Hadron Collider in CERN and unbelievably sophisticated constraint. Nonetheless, it emerged out of being alive and doing the kind of things that scientists do while they're alive. So what is science then, according to this way of thinking? Well, I'm going to argue in this, I'm not alone in this. It's just a field of way of talking about science. It's not particularly possible, but science is a cultural practice that affords members the ability to generate increasingly sophisticated, reliable models, quantitative models, I'll call them wild narratives, of the larger scale contexts or the reality in which we are embedded. Now, I'm using all those words. It sounds like a lot, Scott. Well, why are you using so many words? But all these words are going to pay off later as I try to move away from talking about us as physical, mental systems, talk about us in a different way. To say that science is a practice in no way trivializes science. I love science. At the same time, science exists within life. Science exists within context, and it doesn't transcend context. So keeping it embedded within the reality we're in as part of the reality and the work that we do, instead of looking at science as some special lens that lets me see beyond context, that's precisely what Wild Systems is created to do. And that's why I would have a slide like this, right? So the payoff for me, at least at this point, is that by describing persons, cultures, and science as being nested within reality, the wild narratives perspective can avoid the epistemic gaps that has plagued the science of consciousness for centuries, right? And plagued the way we talk about consciousness for a long time. So I'm just going to talk about what is this epistemic gap. It's a story about how we exist on the other side of reality. So I'm going to tell you a little story before I show you the slide. So imagine a young boy riding his bike down the street and he sees a bracelet. So he pulls his bike up next to the bracelet. He stops his bike. He bends over, picks up the bracelet, and it's a snake, right? What I often do is ask my students, explain this story using the concept real. And the first thing they say is, well, the snake was real. The bracelet was just an incorrect perception, right? So this idea that there's something in my head that doesn't correspond correctly to something outside of my head, that's what I'm going to call the epistemic gap. So this is old philosophy, but you've got trees out there. And the argument is, I know that there are trees outside of me because those trees cause something to happen inside of me, something in my brain, my senses, my ears, my eyes, something happens to them, and then that causes something to happen in my brain. And then I have a representation of that tree in my head. That's the same kind of thinking that goes on with the boy and the snake and the bracelet, right? There's a bracelet out there. And when I ask students if there's anything real about the bracelet, they'll eventually say, well, yeah, he had a real bracelet experience. But that real bracelet experience is never felt to be as real as the snake. And it's those two subtle differences in the use of the word real that I consider to be the problem, right? Now, we feel like the tree is more real than my experience of it if we're using this kind of language. I call big R versus little r. But we also then have words we've built to describe these differences. For example, there are objective trees, meaning what? That they're not subjective trees, right? And then when we get more sophisticated, we call those observer independent trees. And we might call these observer dependent trees. So we've gone from the bracelet and the snake, which is something that you all listen to, and you immediately sense the tension between the idea of real and how we use it differently in those two spaces. And then this is the way that science over time and philosophy over time have taken those basic senses that we have, real, less real, and fleshed them out into complex language, such as observer independent or observer dependent. The point I want to make here is that reality, what's objective, is described as existing on the other side of subjectivity. In other words, you have your impressions of reality. So reality is outside of you. It's called objective. And its reality is being described in contrast to your experiences. So that means that that which is real is that which doesn't depend on an observer. So right now, I don't have the experience that the computer depends on me. I do have the experience that, you know, the talking I'm feeling in my throat belongs to me, right? I have that sense. So I make this basic fundamental distinction between what I feel is mine and what isn't. And we use that distinction, being used by philosophers in science, to define reality in contrast to experience. And this narrative leads to the assumption that there's a gap between the objective and the subjective. And overcoming that gap, redescribing that gap, is at the heart of what Wild System's all about. And ask the question, is there even a gap? And then once we say there's a gap, science then is handed the job of overcoming that gap. So information processing theory is a theory in psychology that it claims what I do is I take information from the world and I process it in my computer brain, and that's how I have experiences. Very useful science. I've used it myself. It helps me predict experiments. Yet at the same time, if you ask me is that how things really work, I would say I don't believe so. Yet at the same time, to be able to do the science, control variables, predict outcomes, I need a rhetoric that allows me to manipulate events, allows me to cooperate with others as we do so. So information processing has proven to be very useful as a rhetorical system and a methodology. But it doesn't have to be my theory of what reality is. It doesn't have to be my ontology. So all I'm going to try to say here is in mid-1800s, Darwin put the nail in the coffin when it came to subjectivity being something unique in reality. In the Western world, he basically told us we're just more physical stuff, right? So the human part of our subjectivity, the human part of us, our feelings, our emotions, our desires, our loves, and our hates. And the argument is these two are physical phenomena being generated by a physical brain. And this just gives rise to these philosophies I've already talked about. Realism is the idea that which is real is that which is independent of subjectivity. All right. So reality, again, is being defined against experience. And then physicalism is the idea that everything that exists is physical. And this affords the emergence of contemporary philosophies, contemporary naturalism, and its assumption of an inherently physical, meaningless reality. And so we've been struggling with, we've got a meaningless physical reality. Our subjectivity must be what brings meaning to reality. And by talking about that, what we're saying is, maybe other organisms have meaning, maybe insects have meaning. And then we run around trying to find out where meaning is and how meaning happens. And the point of wild systems theory is that everything is meaning. There's no thing that is meaningless, right? And the reason that we believe that reality is inherently meaningless is because of our physicalism. And physicalism is, to use the phrase, it's a dialectical concept, which means it gets its meaning in relation to what it's not, which is mentalism, right? So physicalism isn't really a positive theory at all. It's basically what Hegel would call a dialectic. What's it mean to say something physical? It means to say it's not mental. What's it mean to call something mental? It means it's not physical. And we use that language all the time, and we don't We don't, well, we just walk with it, right? It's just how we talk and walk when it comes to these issues. So wild systems theory says, I'm not doing that. Let's try something else. And by describing you, me, all the people we know as being nested within reality versus on the other side of it, the wild narrative's perspective conceptualizes organisms as embodiments of context. And that phrase, embodiments of context, that's, if that's the money item for wild systems theory, right? That's the thing that lets me go from discipline to discipline to discipline and be understood. If I go from discipline to discipline with the word mind, I get understood, but but it doesn't fill the space with meaning like the notion of embodied context. So I'll tell you, I've been working on wild systems theory for a while here, and embodied context probably happened about 7 or 8 years ago. And I just felt like, okay, that's it. That's what I've been looking for. And we can talk more about what that might mean as we go through here. And such embodiments are naturally and necessarily about the context they embody. So what that means is my brain, my muscles, my bones, these are all naturally, meaning we don't need supernatural forces to make them exist. My brain, my bones, my muscles, my heart, these are all naturally and necessarily embodiments of the context that I'm in. And they're all about them. In other words, my brain, lungs, muscles, and skeleton are all about moving a mass as a whole through a gravity field, right? There's for the sports fans in the house, right? So in other words, if I'm going to move this mass as a whole in a coordinated way, it's got to be about oxygen. It's got to be about gravity. It's got to be about the solidity of the Earth's crust. I mean, all that is embodied in the dynamics of what we call the body. And by arguing that, one thing that's happened is by conceptualizing us as embodiments of context, I've bypassed the concept physical, I've bypassed the concept mental, and I have bypassed the concept information. That's the one that gets me in the most trouble. A lot of people really use, and I'm not saying anybody's wrong using the word information, because I know exactly what they mean when they use it, so I can be in that space. If we start talking about reality and meaning, however, then I'm going to start talking about embodied context, because information doesn't do it for me.
So, Scott, if
Yeah, thank you.
I interrupt
Please
you
do.
here, yeah. So, so a very significant aspect of your theory, from this light is where you conceptualize organisms as embodiment of context, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, as a student of literature, if I perceive my literary text as an organism, right? So, in that context, in that case, my literary text would, definitely intersect with a number of forces outside of literature, right?
Yes.
So these could be, say political ideologies, cultural context.
Yes.
These could be social forces, so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So from the perspective of literature, and from the perspective of literary theory, where literary becomes a very heavy baggage with us, students of literature, this prefix, right? So since a particular age would define my literary text, so what was once considered a very clear embodiment of a particular context might be reinterpreted in newer perspectives when we reach another age. So say for example in the literary texts of the past, say God was embodied
Yes.
in the most absolute terms in the established religious systems, right? But then as the time progressed, God started to be embodied in spirituality, and then in the contemporary age, in the text that we have today, in alternative spiritualities.
Yes.
So when your theory suggests that the context itself becomes meaning, right?
Yeah.
And when you just said that meaning is everywhere. So can we really suggest to use your idea here and to use your expression also that you just used a while ago, um, that we're actually in this process, using your theory, we're actually bridging the epistemic gap that is there between the literary works of the past and the works that we have in the present, where the meanings that we arrived at in the past are no longer subservient to the meanings that we arrive
Right.
at today. Yeah, and therefore as you said, the meaning is everywhere, and therefore there's no meaning which is subordinated to another meaning, and therefore there's no meaning which is absolute, right?
Yes.
So just help me here,
No,
if
it's
I
all
can
good,
really
please.
look at the text, my literary text, as a student of literature in this manner, right?
So the key word you used there was there's no absolute meaning, right? And that allows me to say there's no meaning that transcends context. And I'm using the word context in place of the word reality, right? So there's no meaning that transcends reality. There's no meaning. And what I mean by reality is like everything, right? Dare I say, when I talk to my students, I try to explain this notion of reality in terms of what I call infinite water. It has no edge. Reality doesn't have edges. Now, in science, we have things like universes and galaxies and such, and we're still struggling with string theory. So I'm not at all saying those things are wrong. I'm saying those things are amazing narratives, quantitative narratives that are highly replicable, and they're very, very useful. And that doesn't have to be what I call reality. As a matter of fact, it's not even necessary to have to call reality physical. It's not even necessary to have to call reality string theory or something along those lines. So I might be making a slight subtle shift. The thing is, if I would call wild systems theory what I would call it a grounded relativism, right? And so what I mean by that is, and I'm not a scholar in literature. I have read in the area of postmodernism and the deconstructions that go on in postmodernism are, of course, very coherent and consistent with wild systems theory, to the point where it's almost inevitable that deconstructions are going to happen because there are boundaries, but they're not absolute boundaries, right? So it's almost as if wild systems theory would take postmodernism for granted, right? In other words, we're always going to have states of chaos and disruption, and so wild systems then is a non-absolutist approach to everything, to be honest, and it anticipates disruption. It anticipates chaos to the point where if we want to add, if from a wild systems perspective, the underlying structure of reality is chaotic. And then things come to be as a function of capturing energy in ways that stabilize chaos. But the stabilization is never permanent. It's forever contextual, and it can always change, right? So yeah, wild systems theory lets me talk about things in a non-absolutist way that's nonetheless still connected to science, still connected to philosophy and other disciplines. And it's probably because of its trek through all these different areas where you got to come up with a way to say something's a non-absolutist account of reality and then not get stuck, right? Like, someone that studies, quantum physics, you've got a lot of work to do to be an expert in quantum physics. You've got a lot of work to do to learn a literary theory. And when you're spending your 20s learning those theories, they become what you are. They become part of what you are. Now, they have to do that. They become boundaries for how you think, just like I was talking about in the original slide. All of our thoughts are forever boundaries, right? Coming from our work and our collective work. The trick is you got to use those boundaries to write a thesis. You got to use those boundaries to write a dissertation or a paper. You have to use them. At the same time, the trick is to never experience them as absolute. So how do you lean into something that you think, but it's not really real? It's not really true. And the only reason we get stuck thinking those things is because we're stuck on the idea of some kind of final reality, some kind of final truth. And wild systems theory affords me the opportunity not to have to speak that way, to the point where I'm not thinking that way. And then just understanding that I have to necessarily create my own borders with things we call thoughts. I have to learn them, and then I have to use them. And 10 years later, it's like, I don't think that way anymore, right? And that's because you're alive and you're in the world, right? And a lot of people will spend a lot of time living their life in a way that keeps their borders stable, right? Move to a certain neighborhood, go to a particular type of school, wear a certain type of clothing, hang around with certain types of people. All this work is actually stabilizing their life. And I'm not here to be judgy. That's not my point. I don't ask my students if they're racist. What I ask my students is, what stays the same in the world because of the way you live your life every day? And I'm not asking that to be judgy. I'm not asking that to condemn them, but I want to become them. I would like them to become aware that their life isn't just here. Everything they're doing here is constraining everything going on everywhere else. And we don't think of ourselves as embedded in everything. And it's a very destabilizing way to think, by the way, right? Because it's easier, and I'm not being judgy, because I walk on the sidewalk every day and I don't judge whether or not the sidewalk's there. I don't ask myself how it got built and how I'm impacting, fish off the coast of Japan right now. I don't think that way. But nonetheless, if I'm going to talk about reality, that's how I'm going to talk. So yeah, that was a long answer. You threw that word absolute out there, and it just hit precisely where I needed to be in the discussion. Yeah, so it's grounded relativism is what I would call it. And one more thing, I always tell my students one of the greatest achievements of my career is when some young scholar says, here's where Jordan's right and here's where he's absolutely wrong. Then I know that I'm in the game, right? Then I know that I'm in this process instead of, Jordan's forever right, whatever. That's not work. And then I ask myself, what kind of work is someone doing for themselves when they tell me everything I say is right? They're not doing science, they're not doing philosophy, they're doing something else. So I blathered on and on like that. But thanks for the comment.
Yeah, thanks for the response,
Yeah.
Scott. Yeah, thank you.
Mozart's music is about everything, about him, about the life he lived, about the culture he lived in, about the colonialism going on in the world during that time. All of that is there. And when you start to look at the beauty of Mozart's music, you can experience, and you start to experience the whole world that was happening at the same time. It tells you everything you need to know about Mozart's music, right? You have to have a certain type of culture to be able to sit there and write those notes down all the time. And I'm blathering on and on now, but yeah, it's all there. Any other questions or comments? I love the conversation, by the way. Okay, that's cool. I will I'll go back to this. So the big thing here, such embodiments of context are naturally and necessarily about the context they embody. Those are the maneuvers, those are rhetorical maneuvers that allow me to say meaning is everywhere. Because everything's about, and these are the kind of phrases that get me in trouble at philosophical discussions, or your meaning's everywhere, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, it's just the exact opposite of meaning being nowhere, right? And the only reason people believe meaning is nowhere except in their heads is because they bought into a rhetoric of dead physicalism. And that is not a necessary, and this is a strong philosophical word, it is not necessary to believe that. You can be a scientist and not believe the concept physical. You don't need it, but we learn it, we embody it, and then we carry it with us, right? So this, oh, I got to do this. So organisms, embodiments of context, they don't need to process or detect information. Those are big concepts in my area. To be meaningful, rather, they are inherently meaningful and they modulate context while context modulates them. So what the things that information processing theorists would call, sensations and perceptions, I would call modulations. And the reason I use that word modulation is because it speaks to the fact that this is necessarily about all this. And what we do is jointly modulate each other. We don't cause each other. I don't cause the world doesn't cause me. I'm in reality and we're modulating each other as we go through this thing. So we were talking about this idea of what I call embodied aboutness, embodied context, and that's what I would call meaning. The science of consciousness, then I call it the science of embodied contexts. Never really put a whole lot of stake in that idea. It's just when I go to consciousness conferences and I'm trying to talk about science, this is how I would end up talking about it. This science has actually been done by a host of different scholars and a host of diverse disciplines over the past centuries. So what I'm going to just quickly talk about are some scientists who've actually talked this sort of way. They don't use the word embodied context, right? But they do talk about organisms as transformers. So they'll talk about this stuff we live in it. They'll talk about it as a self-organizing energy transformation hierarchy, right? That means that instead of using the concepts physical or mental, they're going to talk in terms of energy. So when I'm entering a scientific conversation along these lines, that's the way I will talk. Self-organizing means there's no instructions outside of reality telling reality what it should be. What we have here emerges contextually and spontaneously out of what's already here. Hierarchy. What this means is that different forms, for example, we on Earth are energy transformers that persist because the sun makes massive amounts of energy available to us all the time. Organisms emerge, we call them plants, that can actually capture the energy from the sun and transform it chemically to allow that in ways that sustain them. And then, of course, once you have a plethora of plant energy, that affords the emergence of herbivore energy, squirrels and such. And then, of course, when you have a plethora of those, it affords the emergence of carnivores, etc. So we all learned all this. It's a web of life. This is just a different way to try to talk about how all these different things are related. And let me talk about it in a scientific way that allows me to point out that people have been doing this kind of work for a long time, just been calling it physical mental stuff. Please note here that when we're talking about us as energy transformers, I'm no longer talking about physical or mental. So, as I said earlier, if the underlying structure of reality is chaotic, and then what we do is emerge and basically capture energy in ways that allows us to stabilize things, how do we do that? Stuart Kaufman proposed the idea of autocatalysis is how I like to say it. But the idea, as you can see, you have A and B here, chemical A, chemical B, they interact, they produce a product, AB. If it turns out that the product of that reaction is a catalyst for the reaction that produced it, that means as A and B interact, they're actually producing their own catalysts that keep the work going. So the actual energy transformations are what I'll call self-sustaining. The work gets done, it produces a product that actually is a catalyst for that reaction. So the reaction actually, in a sense, catalyzes itself. This is Stuart Kaufman then used this idea to argue that living systems are self-metabolizing systems, and the work produces products that sustains the work. I like to call this self-sustaining work because what I want to do in wild systems theory is scale this up from the single cell organisms all the way up to cultures. So, for example, Donald Hebb in the mid 20th century discovered that neurons that fire together wire together. What this means is that when when a neuron generates action potentials, it secretes chemicals across a synapse onto another neuron. That actually gives rise to processes back in the nucleus of that neuron that actually force that neuron to create new connections or new synapses. What this means is that the chemical work, chemical biological work of being a neuron, i.e. generating action potentials, actually catalyzes and sustains being a neuron. It creates more possibilities for its existence. Then Jerry Edelman taught us in the late 20th century that neural networks that we use are the ones that get sustained. So the human brain is creating new neurons up until about age 5-ish. And then what happens is we create more synapses, more connectivity with the neurons that we have. So the idea is those neural networks that you use are the ones that get sustained. A lot of neurons are dying off prior to age 5 because they're not forming connections with other neurons because they're not being used to do the things that you do. And then B.F. Skinner taught us that the work of being a human being, for example, this guy climbing up in this tree, grabbing an apple and eating it, as soon as he grabs that apple and eats it, the chemicals that are released actually feed back into the system of work that he used to get the apple in the first place. B.F. Skinner called this positive reinforcement. The idea that I'm trying to get across here is that we can look at the evolution of life as the capture of energy. We can look at the evolution of life as the scaling up of self-sustaining work. Mark Bickard refers to these, wrote a paper in which he argues that these different systems are connected with each other, reciprocally related. My single cells are reciprocally connected with the rest of my body, the work they do. And then I use this in wild systems theory to try to talk about things like meaning, embodied context, and that sort of thing. So are there other narratives that are consistent with wild systems theory? And I've talked about these things in this context before. My favorite authors, W.G. Sebald, The Rings of Saturn. This is a quote that's just still stunning work. From the first smoldering taper to the elegant lanterns whose light reverberated around 18th century courtyards, and from the mild radiance of those lanterns to the unearthly glow of the sodium lamps that line the Belgian motorways, it has all been combustion. Combustion is the hidden principle behind every artifact we create. The making of a fish hook, manufacture of a china cup, or production of a television program all depend on the same process of combustion. Like our bodies and like our desires, the machines we have devised are possessed of a heart, which is slowly reduced to embers. All right, so what you have here in Sebald, we see the narrative of organisms as energy transformation systems. He doesn't say it like that. He said it in a different way, that necessarily intake, transform, and dissipate energy in order to sustain themselves. Sebald was the son of a Wehrmacht soldier who invaded Poland. So in Sebald, he's got a great book called The History of Destruction, where he's very much focused on how our being, B-E-I-N-G, our actually being generates disorder. They exist within reality and they necessarily modulate it through energy transformation for the purpose of sustainment. And we see ourselves as entropy engines, life and culture simultaneously and inescapably generate order via the creation of disorder. Anytime a single cell organism takes something into itself, takes a protein into itself, it reorganizes it inside itself and dissipates what it doesn't need. I think I'm just going to go ahead and stop there. And then see what your questions are. I did a little bit of the science of wild systems. I did some of the philosophy of wild systems. First of all, thank you for listening. And what might your comments or questions be?
Yes. So I was, listening to the embodiment of context and how you talked about that whatever we do, whatever the living systems are doing, it's all affected by what we're learning or what we're gaining. Like I'm right now understanding a theory and maybe I'll write dissertation, it will all connected, and that's fine. But there are cases or incidents where context isn't really there. What I mean to say is, like in some cases, like spiritual awakenings, we talk about that, like meditation. Through meditation, if
Yes.
you sit in a room, you're meditating, right, and you can have a spiritual awakening. You can have informations that there wasn't there,
Yeah.
on the base, like that happened with maybe Gautam Buddha, or there is a case of Dmitry Mendeleev who, made a periodic table. It came to his dream,
Yes.
right? And so, what I wanted to ask is, how does embody of context actually,
Yeah.
rely in these cases? Because it's not really explains, how
Yeah.
does that happen? How does we perceive information in these things?
No, I love it. Well, thanks for that that comment and that very insightful question. Because what you're doing is taking the idea of embodiment of a context and pushing it, how far can you go with this? And so first thing is embodiments of context are naturally and necessarily about the context they embody. That means the stuff that we call consciousness, the stuff that we call my feelings, the stuff that we call thoughts, those things that we put on the subjective side of the epistemic gap, I refer to those as evolutionarily scaled up forms of aboutness. So a single-celled organism has aboutness, naturally and necessarily. My thoughts are an evolved form of aboutness or evolved form of embodied context. So I only said that because I just wanted to make sure that when I talk about embodied context, I'm applying it to not just the entire living system, kingdom, whatever, but everything. So I would argue that the phenomena that we call quarks have aboutness. The phenomena we call electrons have aboutness. This is not a way we're used to talking about them in that. So when you talk about these states, for example, spiritual awakening, meditative states, so I'm not someone who meditates. What I know from what I've read and heard about meditation is exactly what you said. You put yourself within a space that affords you the ability to get into the state you would call meditation. Now, there are data to indicate that people who are expert meditators actually have energy brain signatures that are very much like people who are taking LSD or hallucinogenic drugs. And that energy signature is higher, more powerful than daily waking life. Now, what happens when we take LSD or something like a hallucinogenic drug is actually areas of the brain that are usually not communicating with each other very much are actually free to do so. So one of the things that happens in a brain on LSD is that you start to taste colors, right? You start to see sounds because the borders your brain is creating every day that allow you to see the sidewalk, walk on it, say hi to a friend. Those neural boundaries are sort of, the constraints are released a bit so that organizations can happen in your brain that tend not to happen in waking life. Now, in waking life, we spend a lot of time actually focusing and constraining our brain. We call it paying attention. So when you're paying attention, what you're doing is organizing your brain to be maximally sensitive to the text you're reading, the key you're looking for, the voice you're trying to hear at that party, the person you're trying to see, right? You're reorganizing your system in ways that makes you maximally sensitive to certain things while simultaneously making you less sensitive to other things, right? And we're in that waking state doing that work, being alive most of the time. When people go to do a state called meditation, they actually put themselves in a context that affords not being bothered, not being interrupted. So there usually aren't going to be other people talking. There usually isn't going to be a whole bunch of loud music. You're not going to be meditate. I'm not saying nobody does this, but what I'm saying is most time people put themselves in these places, and then what they do is they actually, my understanding of the practice, one method is to focus intensely on some experience, a color or whatever. Your breath is a place that people often start. Focus on it, and then over time, release that focus. And when you release that focus, you're in this state that seems like you're not paying attention, right? You've put yourself in a state that allows your brain organizations to be more fluid. And it's in that space of neurofluidity. I've never said that phrase before. I don't even know if it's a phrase, but it's in that non-attentive state. And I know people that are experts in meditation are going to take issue with how I'm explaining it, and I apologize. What I do think you do is create a brain that's more massively open. And that openness then, dare I say, makes you sensitive to contexts you may not otherwise be sensitive to, because you're busy creating boundaries to be in this space at this time during, live your life in the day. So meditation according to wild systems theory, meditation doesn't allow us to transcend context. It does allow, I have had experiences that I would call an equivalent of meditation. They were just bizarre experiences out in the natural world, out in nature. I do feel, and I did feel, unbelievably connected to everything. All right. I remember that I was in the Smoky Mountains. A hurricane had just come through. The sky was crystal clear. The moon was full. And I knew that I was the second thing that the rays from the sun were hitting, right? They were hitting the moon, and then they were hitting me. And I really felt that cosmically connected in that moment. So those states, they do exist. Of course, I would never deny that they exist. And at the same time, I don't think they transcend context. I think they might afford us the ability to be increasingly about contexts we may not feel ourselves to be as about during waking life. I hope that made any sense. I appreciate the question because it forces me to, really stretch the concept of context. And one thing I will say is that the concept of context does not satisfy people the way the concept physical does. If I say this cup is physical, everybody's fine, and I'll be invited back to the party, right? But if I start saying this cup is an embodiment of a context, people are going to get mad. And it's not how they think, it's not how they work. And I'm not being judgy about them being mad. It's the only way that I can talk about meaning in ways that feel maximally coherent, without subjective, objective divides and such. All right, I'm going to stop there. I hope that was, and please feel free to just chime in, talk back and forth, because I'm working on wild systems theory as well, right? So,
yeah. So Scott, to take this particular example that you've just given to us, and also if you go back to the rings of Saturn, that you had quoted, and if we talk about this particular discussion, say using your concept of say energy transformation system, within a larger energy transformation system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, when we specifically, we're talking about rings of Saturn, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here we have say a literary text from this perspective could be viewed as to again use your idea there. So nested within the corpus, within the entire corpus in its entirety, right?
Yes.
And hence making the reader way beyond these very, very rigid binaries, of, West versus East, and universal versus regional, because, the very concept, that is being, talked about, or the concept that is at the center, of this particular work is, where he deals with the exploitation of environment, which is not a regional concept at all, which is a universal concept. And also, to talk about this idea, that Chirag had just, mentioned here. So again, if you were to view this in the context of, energy transformation system, and if you're going to, view this, as a microcosm. So now I'm not really looking at the literary text here, but I'm looking at myself, who's really looking at a literary text in terms of, how it liberates me. So for instance, to this particular text that you just quoted. So here, we're going to have, interactions within the microcosm that will, take place, these energy interactions, that will take place at two levels, which obviously is the mind and the body, right? But then the transcendental experiences, that we have, or the sense of transcendence, that we have, through these kind of texts. So we are assuming that, the interaction is not just happening at the two levels, which are, body and mind, but also at the level of soul. If I take the liberty of, looking at it from the Eastern perspective, because, I would, believe in the fact that there's a third level also. And also that, the microcosm, as a reader, as a microcosm, I'm also going to interact with, macrocosm here. So where the energy transfer and the interaction, is happening at three levels within me as a reader, but at the same time, it's interacting with the macrocosm also. So yes, there, we have a very liberating, idea, for discussion, when we're going to view, such works, and we're going to look at, such works in view of your theory, because we're not just, looking at, certain ideas from just one perspective here, but then from a perspective where the interaction is taking place, at all the three levels, and then, the interaction is also taking place with the macrocosm as well. Yeah, right.
So, I agree completely. I'm using the word aboutness in ways that would probably be similar to these larger levels that you're discussing. The way we've talked about them in the world I live in is God, spirit, transcendence, and I understand what those mean. And, I don't argue with people about those things unless we start talking about the reality of meaning, right? And then I'll start talking about embodiment of context, and I'll talk about multi-scale context. And an easy way to think about it is basically what you said. Life goes on. I'm sitting here focusing on something, and reality is still doing everything it does, and I'm still about it, right? All kinds of things happen to people all the time that remind them how much they're about everything else, like earthquakes, tsunamis, right? All these things are happening all the time, and we're about it. It's just the constraints are in place that afford us the ability to not have to consciously tend to it right now, right? So, I think that's, and it may sound awkward to talk in terms of energy, and I'm completely comfortable with the idea that scientifically 30, 50 years from now, that won't be the concept people are using. They'll be using some other system because string theory will have unpacked something that will get us talking that way. Even if that happens, wild systems theory doesn't go away, because the notion of embodied context is kind of, dare I say, transdisciplinary, right? It works in literature, it works in science, it works in art, it works in dance, it works everywhere that I know of and have been. And that's precisely why it was created. Fully knowing that the current scientific narrative I'm telling about multi-scale energy transformation systems probably going to be replaced in 50 years. Not hell, with quantum computers, who knows what's going to happen, right? So yes, I appreciate your comments, and we are living in the transcendental all the time, and we're able to organize ourselves in ways within certain contexts that afford us the ability to be maybe more directly in touch with that sort of stuff. I'm not trying to say anything here that's, anti-spiritual. It's quite the opposite. And I'm trying to figure out a way to talk about what people call spiritual and non-spiritual with a common language, and about, embodied context does that for me. And then it also draws attention to the very thing you just mentioned about the work you're looking at right now is taking place within larger work. And it's only by creating borders that we're able to focus on one level, and we can shift our focus. And it's fantastic.
Okay, so Scott, I really wanted to ask you about, you've talked about evolutionary scale up of meaning, in your research paper. So basically, you've mentioned that it starts with very simple cells, single celled organisms, right?
Yeah.
Then it's very low energy tasks are followed out, carried out, and then it moves on to very complex beings like us humans.
Yeah.
So how does the idea of proto consciousness, how does this scale up to the level of humans? It's so complex that's a huge gap between single cell and humans. So how does it really scale up from there to here?
Well, again, thank you for that amazingly insightful question. And I'm the answer I'm going to give is not something I created. Back in the 90s, I was walking through the library at the university, and I saw this cover of a journal. The journal is called New Ideas in Psychology. And the title, the article, it may have been the Target article, is called A Thermodynamic Holonomic Resolution to the Mind-Brain Problem. And it was written by a guy called Larry Vanderbilt. And I got in touch with him. We talked. And so a lot of the stuff I'm talking about, autocatalysis and multi-scale ups and stuff, that a lot of that comes from Vanderbilt. And he was influenced by a person I cite in those papers by the name of Odum, O-D-U-M, who put forward the notion of the energy transformation hierarchy and actually quantified how much plant energy it takes to sustain a herbivore, et cetera. So this, if according to Odum and then Vanderbilt, who basically takes Odum's work and then applies it to cognition, right? The idea is it allows, when we go from single cell to multicellular systems, there's a whole science of genetics, there's a whole science of biology that would talk about how a multicellular system can emerge from single cell systems. And the payoff is energy transformation, right? If you're a single cell in a multi-cell system, you actually get your energy easier, right? And so what we find is systems that systems that come to be that are more capable of capturing energy are actually able to sustain themselves, of course, but also more likely to reproduce themselves. And it's Maturana and Varela who used the notion of autopoiesis. And it's very similar to the notion of autocatalysis. I go in different directions than Maturana and Varela did. I go in different directions than Vanderbilt. I go in different directions than Odum because I'm trying to address the issue of meaning. They were trying to do physics, or they were trying to do cognitive science, or they were trying to do, cellular biology. So their destinations constrained, just as my destination constrained the way my concepts would maneuver and be able to work in my language system. So for the scale up, I borrow the idea of energy, and those systems that are better able to capture energy per unit work they do themselves are the ones that are most likely to persist. Now, let's look at this is some slides I didn't show, but when we look at how ants persist, right? Ants are systems that dissipate and detect pheromones. Those are just chemicals that their bodies generate and put into the environment, and they're sensitive to context. So we've all been baffled by ant intelligence for a long time. It's like, man, how do they do that? They're not talking to each other. How are they doing that without communicating? And in fact, what they're doing as they come out of the nest in the morning, they end up leaving the nest and walking out in a sort of a 360-degree structure around the nest. And then there's no plan for them all to go off in general directions. It's just, otherwise they're going to all walk on top of each other, right? So just the constraints of their bodies gives rise to this 360 thing leaving the nest. But they're also generating pheromones as they move. Now, what this means is that these ants are changing the world. They are changing the context within which antness exists. As they secrete those pheromones, they're laying down a pheromone gradient. In other words, the gradient's probably most robust right by the nest where the ants are most densely near each other. And then as they spread out, the pheromone gradient gets smaller, it dissipates, it gets smaller and smaller, concentration becomes smaller and smaller because there's more space. That is meaning. I mean, that's intense meaning. And what happens is when an ant finds food, and I am going to answer your question, I apologize, building it up. As the ants capture food, capturing that food changes the pheromones that they dissipate. And as they capture the food, they start following the pheromone gradient back to the nest. Now, it's not something like the ant thinks to itself, oh my gosh, now I got to go all the way back. It's what they are. The organization of the system is such that in the presence of this pheromone, it will follow a concentration gradient of another pheromone back to the nest. So we get this incredibly complex system emerging, and we those of us who do cognitive science, we get baffled, like, man, that's so intelligent. Well, if we think of the ants as a system that's existing at multiple time scales, so you've got the chemistry within an ant, you've got the biology of an individual ant, the cells within that ant's body communicate, connect with each other, do work with each other in that chemical way, and then the ants end up organizing around each other in a chemical way. Right. That means that the ant being is kind of constrained by what they're able to organize themselves with, which is a chemical gradient, right? That example allows us to see the ant as not an individual ant. Of course, it's, as we were saying earlier, it's an individual ant doing its thing that's nested within a larger group of ants that are spontaneously giving rise to a world full of chemical gradients. Now, no ant has the intention to create a chemical gradient, right? It's just being an ant. But because they're coupled and sensitive with each other in these ways, these structures emerge that we think have to be thought out ahead of time. And that's just not how it plays out. So we got ants. They're kind of limited by the chemical constraints, right? They've been extremely successful on this planet, by the way, just playing in their, chemical world. I like to argue that what we call words are actually like cognitive pheromones, in the sense that we put words out in the world that we basically embody from a family. We don't even know we're embodying words. It's just a way of being with people. If you watch a kid who's pre-verbal, what I've seen, I haven't done research on it, but my kids learned the music of language before they learned the words of language. So my kids would sit there and go, blah, 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 blah. And I go, yeah, blah, 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 blah. And we would have this musical interaction, and they were learning how to couple themselves with me in this kind of musical space. And it was full of affect. It was full of emotion. It was full of trust. Trust develops over time because I didn't harm them, right? So they just get used to me in this space with them. And then and at some point they start putting words on the music. All of this is happening because it pays for itself. By being able to be with me in this musical space, I find myself more deeply connected to them. So children that don't have the ability to do those kinds of things find themselves not connecting well with other human beings. And the developmental psychologist might say it would lead to attachment issues later in life. So my point is, at every step of the way, the work is somehow producing a product that's keeping that work going. So that aside, we put words in the world, we put books in the world, we put cars in the world, we put buildings in the world. Now we've got Zoom in the world that allows us to actually be here in this space, wherever that space really is, right? And all the work's paying for itself because we're all having a great time, but we're also all in this space of what I just want to call, cognitive bubbles that we're sharing with each other. And it pays for itself, right? And it doesn't have to pay for itself right here. It's also going to pay for itself if you end up, even if you decide not to use this idea in your thesis, this conversation will have had an impact on your thesis, right? It'll pay for itself. At very least, you'll say, no, man, that's not what I want to do. And you won't do that, but it'll still be part of what you do because it's part of what you're not doing. Sorry, that's too bizarre. But so things pay off for us at many time scales simultaneously. All right, so the question was a scale up. I started with the ants and I jumped immediately to humans. We could see that what goes on with carnivores is the need to chase something to capture the energy in a herbivore. And that chase requires that I be able to propel myself as a whole through a gravity field to a location the prey is going to be. Not where it is, because if I chase where it is, I'll eat dirt, right? So things emerge called brains. And what those brains allow us to do is connect ourselves and manage ourselves in larger and larger time scales, to the point where, like, I'm here in the United States right now. It's 20 after 11. You're there. It's late in the evening. We're both experiencing this moment, however, in relation to those larger time scales. For example, you guys might be tired. I may need another cup of coffee, but I'm also experiencing the moment in relation to what I'm going to be doing at 2 or 3 o'clock, right? So those time scales are all in what I'm doing now. And so the payoff, is always at multiple time scales. And I'd even argue that we're living in multiple time scales. That's another issue. But so the payoff's there, it'll always be there. And sometimes it's don't do that. So when a brain develops this ability to organize itself, I'm just cutting. I can explain this more if you want, but if a brain, as a matter of fact, we will talk about this more on Monday when we talk about the embodiment of anticipation, right? Because I argue even a single cell organism is anticipatory in the sense that the boundary it creates with the world, its context, actually persists at a larger time scale than the individual work of the chemicals that make up the cell. So you have two nested scales of work, and this larger scale is constraining the future possibilities of these things that make it up. It's this nesting of constraint that I call anticipation, and brains are masterful at embodying context and then generating boundaries, what we might call thoughts, to help us constrain where we're going to be, to the point where, like, guys, we've been planning on this for a month now. And all of us have been organized. We all organized our days so that this, what happened now. So we don't live in just the now. And that's probably why everybody says, calm down and just live in the now, right? Because we're so living in all these different times. So for me, the scale up is energy all the way, top to bottom. I would argue that happiness, joy are forms of energy. And humans do a lot of things just because they're fun. Humans do a lot of things just because they, quote unquote, want to. So all of those are forms of energy. And I hope that in any way answered your question, Ishika.
Yes, yes, you perfectly answered the question. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very kind. You're free to, ask a follow-up or talk about a follow-up or whatever you guys want.
Scott, I just was wondering, how's it that, we, students of literature, when we're going to analyze our texts and we're going to talk about poetic processes and creative processes. So how's it that we're going to really look at the concept of energy? Because, this is, one very important idea, that has been discussed, in your theory. So can we really look at, this particular concept in view of insight or intuition, because that is a very important, force that actually helps in creativity.
Yes.
So yet to really, deliberate on that. But then, I was wondering, if that could be, extended, as an idea, of what you've been talking about here. Because these are very in very scientific these are very scientific discussions that we actually see in your
Right.
research papers, but then the very idea is how is it that we're really going to use those discussions for our good when we are analyzing certain texts, starting from the orientation of the creator to the creative processes, and then to the characters who've been talked about by the creator, and then how's it that the energy moves from the creator to the reader. So and then
so if we look like, here's my copy of the Rings of Saturn, right?
Okay.
And, if someone would say, you've somehow read Sebald's mind, we have that bothers us. Or it sounds poetic, right? But if I say that Sebald transformed his context in a way that allowed what he was about to transform what I'm about, no one has a problem with that, right? And that's the most important thing about wild systems theory, is not necessarily the scientific story, right? The idea of multi-scale energy transformation system, like I said, in 15 years, that may be quantum bubbles. And the thing that wild systems theory allows me to do is stay grounded in everything, and then find when I'm tripping on my own boundaries that I have to create, to use words. I look at words as necessary boundaries, right? And I would look at a rhetorical system as an organism to some extent. So while I'm saying, yes, Sebaldness transformed my context, it's still all describable in terms of energy, but energy being captured in different ways, if you like. So, for example, there's the biological autocatalytic aspect, and then there's the paper, the ink, that are all also forms of energy in some way. Not the autocatalytic energy that sustains my system, but stuff that gets studied in physics and chemistry. Those stabilities get manipulated in ways that allow a transformation that Sebald produced in his context to show up and transform mine. Now, the transformations that come into me as a function of consuming Sebald are going to be massively constrained by what I've embodied, right? And the first time I read this book, it's like, what the hell is this? You don't get to have a story about one person per se, but I felt that it just kept violating my expectations. But the idea of voice, someone speaking, just never stopped. So you read 5 or 6 pages of Sebald and you forget who's speaking. But that's the craft, right? I've never met Sebald. He passed away in the 90s. It's just, he was definitely trying to deconstruct a lot of traditional literary tropes about identity in novels and such. So the energy part of wild systems isn't necessarily the part that may be most interesting to literature scholars. And the thing is, if I'm talking to literature scholars, I talk the way I did in the paper I wrote for your book, right? Because the creative process you talk about, right? So I will admit, I do write. I write a lot of song lyrics. And when you find yourself doing something creative like poetry, it's not necessarily the same thing as meditation, because you're not giving up focus, but you are giving up some constraints on how you use language. And you're using language to tap into less linear forms of experience. And a good poem, okay, I'm not a literature scholar, yet at the same time, I would say a good poem is one that taps into multiple levels of aboutness at the same time. So the words are precisely constructed to not allow you to pay attention in a linear way like you're doing now as I talk, right? They're precisely written to disrupt, to recurse, and then you get to the third stanza, and the meaning of the first two changes. That's why I would read poetry. That's why I would write it, because it's a different form of aboutness that uses words. And so when, one of the problems students face is that, particularly in science like psychology, they come in and we train them to write a completely non-poetic form of expression, because in a scientific paper, you're not supposed to be there, right? It's an introduction, methods, research, results, and discussion. And you don't say I, right? So you got to figure out how to talk about things without using passive voice. It's really hard to learn. And that's one way that we use the words. And at the same time, when I'm writing a song, when I'm writing a story, I'm in a different kind of space. I'm in a less, I don't want to say less constrained, but it's not as linear, right? And to be honest, even when I'm writing a scientific paper, if it ever looks like it was well written, it's because I rewrote it 30 times. It's because I use my own experience of the text to try to feel what it's like to read the work. And if it doesn't work, I have to rewrite it. And then what people miss is that by putting it out in the world, by writing it on paper, I actually now look at it and bring different processes to it that are difficult to bring to bear when I'm just thinking. So this process, for example, it's easy for us to deconstruct things in perception than it is in thought, right? So write a paper, I put a paragraph out there. Now I can deconstruct it in ways, and then I can change it and go back and forth. And a lot of students don't experience writing as that sort of creative act. And same with poetry, it's recursive. I write, rewrite. And what am I doing? I'm using my own feelings of it as a way to assess its coherence, its status as a poem. So, yeah, I'll say that because my favorite philosopher is Michael Oakeshott. And he works very hard to distinguish what he calls modes of experience. And he calls science a mode of experience, poetry a mode of experience, politics a mode of experience. And he claims that there's truth in all of them, but the constraints are not objective versus subjective measures of truth. Truth is a level of coherence, non-contradictory nature. So when science, the truth criterion is quantitative coherence, on how quantitatively coherent is this view? How much data can it take into and account for? And he argues that there really are no truth constraints on poetry. So that was a long answer. I hope I got there in any way.
So that makes a lot of sense. That reminds me of how, poetic processes, had been talked about way back in the Romantic period, where there was a lot of focus on subjectivity and emotions, where
Yes.
Wordsworth, being one of very important,
Yes.
poets, but at the same time, a very important, theorist, who had, talked about poetic processes, back then, when he said, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotions, but then he says, at the same time, he says, that I really don't write poetry, then and there, when I experience those emotions. But then, when I, come back and, I actually allow those emotions to rest. And, when I get, time to spiritualize those emotions, which is, sieving those emotions, is, when, poetry is created.
Yep.
So yes, there is again, gap, that we have between, how, how we observe something and, how it reacts on us. And then, we actually allow those emotions to, rest, in time. And then, we actually create poetry. So yes, so interesting, notions there. But yes, the theory obviously, has the scope of, being used here, when we're going to talk about, these processes. But then I'm a little apprehensive about, how is it that we're really going to use the term energy, because we should not be really using the term energy in a loose sense at all, because this is a very scientific notion, that has been talked about, within your, framework, in your conceptual framework. So I think, I think that will need,
just to quickly follow up, when I say emotions are energy, it does sound a bit poetic, yet at the same time, if I'm going to take wild systems theory seriously, then I have to say, yeah, it's a form of energy transformation. And to some, that feels like I'm devaluing it, right? So the way like I said, energy is the scientific language to move away from the idea that minds are computers. That I want to go in the route of the Mataran and Varela sort of autopoiesis thing. At the same time, the notion of embodied context is the thing that really works for literature, I think. Mozart was an embodiment of his context, his paper, his pen. And if we think about everything as being an embodiment of context, then we see that meaning never slips out, right? And meaning and then is basically transformed. And what we're doing when we're reading a older text is we're transforming it again. And so, there's no point where the meaning escapes or goes somewhere else. We're just continually transforming what we're about. And good literature, like Sebald, is able to transform me in ways that give rise to what I call a transpersonal experience, right? I really feel like I'm part of everything when I read 5 pages of Sebald. And that's why I claim it's a kind of a technology in a sense. And good writers have read their own work as they write it and using themselves as the test for what works and what doesn't. And any writer knows when that moment when they've got it, it's like, man, that's awesome, right? And they might read it 10 years later and said, I can't believe I wrote that. But nonetheless, in the moment, it feels full, it feels coherent. And so I think embodiment of context, if that would be a way to help us understand what we're doing when we're writing, what we're doing when we're reading, what it means. Because as soon as you start writing about literature, the word meaning is going to show up within 3 paragraphs. And, a lot of emphasis right now on joint meaning making, that's a lot of and I'm not here to say that those phrases are wrong, right? I understand what people say when they say joint meaning making. And I'll go along with the conversation. I don't have to, disrupt it. At the same time, when we start talking about the reality of meaning, then I have to go wild systems and talk about embodied context, because that's the only way that I've been able to make it work for me while simultaneously. It's the only way that meaning is necessarily existent. That's philosophical, but that's why it was written. So, yep. Okay. Yeah. Do we think go ahead.
So just another thought there, because, I mean, your theory is invested in both, science and philosophy,
Yeah.
and therefore, there are certain philosophical ideas, that have been talked about, in the works, and because especially, I mean, we also, need to be very selective, as a scholar, as a student, I need to be very selective in terms of the literary text that I'm going to pick up, when I'm going to use your theory,
Right.
because so in the sense, it should, it should go way beyond, those binaries, those rigid binaries, should not be really talked about, in any sense, in that particular text. And also, there has to be a universal truth, a very profound one, that has to emerge, through that particular text.
Yeah.
So in that sense only, I need to be very, very selective in terms of, the text that I'm going to evaluate, using your theory. Yeah.
So next Monday, you mentioned maybe 2 papers. We'll talk about the anticipation scale-up issue in one paper, and the cycle of holism. We'll talk about that as well. And it's just this idea of what philosophy to pick. And certain philosophies I think are kind of wearing out. And dare I say, I think wild systems might be what I call a 21st century holism. That is basically just a reframing of philosophy from 100 years ago and 100 years before that. So I just feel very comfortable putting myself in the space of a working scholar in his or her or their time, right? And don't expect it all to last forever and be the last thing. And I'll just say this, and then maybe we'll end it for the day. And a lot of times students will go into graduate programs and, in psychology, philosophy, literature, and they get filled with moments of self-doubt. Like, what am I doing? Right. And is this really gonna, and all these things that actually hurt the work. And all I can tell you is it took me a long time to feel a part of the scholarly world as a wild systems theorist. It's been something that's been building since my first paper was probably 98, right? So it's been a while. What I came to discover or understand is that diversity is not the exception. Diversity is the rule, and people work very hard to create non-diverse contexts. And they have to work so hard because diversity is the rule. There is a place in this world for all of us, right? And I have no idea, just like, we met in 2018. I have no idea that would result in today. And so my point is, don't ask yourself what the work is worth. That's not for you to answer, right? What's for you to answer is to do good work. Listen to people you respect. Let them criticize your work if they're nice about it, right? And you'll work with whoever you work with. But don't ask yourself, is this worth it? Now, you can ask yourself, what's this going to cost me? Right? That I understand, because we've got all kinds of other things we got to sustain in our lives that take money. That I understand. So is it going to cost? Yes. But don't ask yourself if it's worth it or not, because, that's who you are. That's what you're doing. And that's where you are in your life right now. So it's all worthy. It's all work. It's all worthy. And I'm going on again. But also make sure when you're asking yourself a question about the work, is it worthy? And why am I doing this? Make sure you ask the question, is it because I want other people to say I'm smart? Is it because I want to be the person that gets invited to those conferences? It's because I want to be the person that's the chairperson of that group. Those are not bad things to want. What happens to people, though, is they let those wants exist and they don't know them. And then they lose their agency, because then they start blaming the world for why they're doing everything. Well, I got to do this if I want to publish. I got to do this. Well, yeah, and you don't, right? So enjoy the work while you do it as best you can. And that means enjoy the frustration of trying to produce something that's good, because producing something good is a pain in the butt. It's just work, work, work. And there's joy that comes with it. And there's sorrow that comes with it. And yeah, okay. So that'll be my last bit for today.
Okay,
Thank you so
I,
much. I mean, can't thank you enough.
No,
Scott.
please. I
Uh-huh.
love this conversation. Any final
Can I-
comments from anyone? Please do.
Okay, so since you brought up this topic of diversity and non-diversity, I have a question about culture,
Yeah.
and I'm trying to understand culture in the context of the embodied
Mm,
in the context of embodied context,
yep.
because you said that self-sustainment requires making borders. So for that matter, culture itself is a border that we create in
Yes.
order to self-sustain ourselves,
Yes.
particularly emotionally, because it's the culture that provides that type of containment and that type of that code of conduct that will help us self-sustain within, particularly within a geographical area. And this is why, this is where the idea of patriotism kicks in, because this is not to argue for chauvinism or to argue against cultural diversity. But again, I want to stress about this idea of indigenous lifestyle, because it's usually associated with a decrease or low standards of living. And so we start giving up on our cultures in order to increase our standards of life. But what skips our minds is that culture is another way to self-sustain.
Yeah.
And
no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, you can go ahead. It's okay.
No, so first, I absolutely love this comment. I love this question. You're absolutely right. I saw a talk a couple of weeks ago. We have a series on colonialism once a month at the university, and a gentleman used the word coloniality. And what I loved about that concept was even if a colonized culture gets its freedom from the colonizer, usually the energy transformation infrastructure of that colonized culture has been so drastically transformed from the indigenous roots that it had that people don't sustain themselves by the same dynamics they did prior to the colonization. So education's different, language is different, the food they eat might even be different, and so the way they interact with people might be different. So when the colonizing force leaves, they're not the same. And the struggle, that everything you said there is exactly the point. So for example, if a colonizing force brings in food, things that sustain the length of one's life, a technology, a medicine, or whatever, brings its infrastructure into a place, people live longer, maybe certain diseases are addressed that weren't addressed that were addressed in a different way in an indigenous system. People are faced with the challenge of, do they give that up or not? And those are literally life and death questions. So coloniality is extremely real. And I do think Wild Systems gives me a way of, I didn't use Wild Systems once when I was talking to you, but the idea of the context having been radically transformed, energy being transformed in different ways. So indigenous cultures managing their energy collection, i.e. their food, the way they do, and then an industrialized system comes in. That industrialized system generates more food, which allows the perpetuation of more people. So what happens then is everything's about everything and nothing's about itself. The indigenous life constrained itself in terms of how many people were in a group. And that is sustained and constrained by how they harness their energy. If it's hunter-gatherer, or if it's agricultural, all of those things constrain how that life is lived. So when those larger constraints just get disrupted and reorganized, the challenge is that that former way of life wasn't the way things were supposed to be. It's the way things were contextually. And now that context has been so radically transformed that it's not clear that that former way of being is actually afforded anymore. So this I don't know if I'm helping or answering anything, but this is very real. And yeah, all of culture is border construction. Borders have got a lot of negative connotations right now, and it's one of the harder words I have to use in wild systems theory, because any self-sustaining system, the work of the system, necessarily creates a boundary between the system and the context. That's a necessary condition of being a system. That border construction is why you all can hear my voice right now and not feel like you're creating these thoughts. You feel them coming into you from my voice. But you're also having thoughts like right now, like, oh, wow, he's right. That's kind of cool, right? And you know that those are yours. You know those are yours because the brain system is organizing boundaries that allow you to distinguish you from the not you, all right? And so I've called these boundaries a curse, but I don't mean curse in a negative, childish way. I mean curse in the sense that we're constrained to be with each other through these bubbles. Yet we don't feel ourselves making them. I don't feel myself creating any of these words, so it doesn't feel like I am doing any work. They don't feel like they're my creation. So I put them out there, and I just feel like I'm pointing to reality as it is. And this transparency in our ability to create these bubbles is wonderful, because if you felt your brain making every word you make, you wouldn't be able to talk. If you felt so not being aware of some things is very helpful. Yet at the same time, we bear the brunt of not understanding sometimes that we're creating them, right? So I went all there, all fun. I hope what I said about diversity and colonization made any sense. It's something I've been talking a lot about the last couple of months.
Yes, if you could just repeat this idea about industrialization, because these are the kind of themes I'm dealing with in my research. And
Yeah.
I was thinking about this idea of industrialization in the sense that one of the things we're dealing with now is overpopulation, and
Yep.
all the blame of the symptoms that industrialization is causing is put on overpopulation. For example, sustainability experts say that the planet will not be able to the ecosystem will not be able to sustain itself, because more people we need more water, more food, more energy, and this means we're generating more pollution, and we're destroying the ecosystem because of overpopulation, whereas it's actually industrialization. But there is another underlying issue behind industrialization, because I've been reading about Murray Bookchin's theory of ecology, socialist ecology. No, social ecology, because it's also part of my research. And he addressed this idea that our attitude towards nature stems originally from our attitude towards fellow human beings. And it all boils down to the idea of domination. It's because we want to dominate the other, then we need to dominate nature. And in tribals, it all started, according to him, it all started with the disintegration of the tribal system, because the tribal system is an egalitarian system as opposed to industrial system or agrarian systems, because all the destruction happening in the ecosystem is because of this elite, the ruling elite, be it financial elite or political elite or even religious at times. It's because these the ruling elite is hankering for domination. And in fact, if we blame it all on overpopulation and we start working in the direction of decreasing population, we're doing a disservice to the ecosystem, because, as you said, we are entropy engines. And so if we destroy human beings, which are entropy engines, and then we drain natural resources, which I guess are also entropy engines for that matter. I'm not sure about that. But if we destroy these two elements, this means there is no, we are annihilating the feedback loop that will help the system regenerate, or self-regulate, or to be resilient. So
so I agree, and I think one of the things, well, in order for one not to have empathy, what happens is one creates what I'll call a cognitive bubble that converts their dissonance. Someone has something you want, you don't want to harm them, you harm them, but to not feel bad about harming them, you tell yourself a story about why they weren't worthy of moral consideration. So heathens, you just come up with cognitive labels that keep you from feeling the empathy. Any self-sustaining system that produces products that toxify the context in which it's trying to sustain itself will deselect itself as a species. So the industrial system is, in a sense, potentially deselecting not just the human species, but all kinds of organisms are already extinct as a function of the way we've transformed our context. Now, the thing is, your comment about tribal culture is on target. Tribal culture, the size of a tribe and the types of organizations that they generated and sustained were all constrained by their technology. Now, I'm using the word constraint not to mean limiting, as if there's somehow some non-limited space we can get to. I don't believe that. I think the reality is ultimately embodiment of constraint. And in order to have a whole lot more, increasingly large number of people available, alive, to pump the kind of energy that needs to be pumped through 8 billion people, is just required terraforming. I mean, we've basically transformed what the earth is like, right? I'm just amazed at how much concrete, how many rocks have been turned into roads. When you think about just driving somewhere, God, how much of the earth has been transformed this way. And what are people gonna think about when they see this 200 years from now and we're not using cars anymore? Like, what the hell did you guys do, right? You just rewrote the whole thing, right? There was never a plan. It's just like ants with another way to get food. And that's what we've been doing. Now, this idea you mentioned of empathy and not empathizing, that is, and I'm going to try to be descriptive. That is one of the areas in which the notion of energy transformation works very, very well. Because when we recognize that we are self-sustaining, constrained systems, it gives us a different view on things like freedom and morality. That 20th century or 16th century Western humanism has given us a rhetorical system that just hasn't helped, right? But if one can understand that every time I put gas in my car, I'm helping to sustain a cultural conflict in the Middle East, and every time I do that, it's helping that persist, then I think we can come to ways to think about how I might change my daily life to manage that differently if that's what I want. Now, the thing about the industrial world is it gave rise to a media machine. It's not an evil plan. People want you to continue buying their stuff. So they show you stuff that you like. And you keep watching and we keep buying. It doesn't have to be an evil scheme. However, when people start making tons of money off of it, then they start constraining the system more to maximize their own profit. And my God, industrialization, I mean, not to get too historical, but World War I, some argue, was the result of the Industrial Revolution and the fact that the train system allowed troops to be moved in ways they couldn't have ever been moved prior to the creation of a train system. So all these people doing all these things, if we survive, it'll be because we find a way to transform energy that isn't so toxic. And what that will be, I'm not sure. If we do, the irony is, and please don't get mad at me, the irony is that being able to create that new type of energy emerged out of all the destructive forms of energy we created. In other words, particle colliders are massive, massive investments in energy transformation. YouTube is just sitting there being fueled by stuff that is in no way self-sustaining and continually toxifying our context, right? Now, I know I use YouTube, so I'm not trying to say I'm not a sinner. The issue is, how much can you take? How much can you be aware of? And that's why a lot of people spend their time not being aware by consuming media, by doing things that keep their bubble intact. And I'm not being judgy. I'm trying to be descriptive here, because if we do want a way out, if we want to do way to something different, I think we get there by looking at us in a 21st century energy-based holism versus a 16th century humanism, 17th century humanism that doesn't beg us to look at the destructive nature of being. And Wild Systems does that. And then if you can recognize how much the Caribbean was transformed by colonialism, then why it's very difficult to get a culture going when you're in this disrupted state of your infrastructure having been replaced, but this isn't the one you created. The gentleman who gave the talk and told me about the term of coloniality told me that his culture had been colonized by the French, and they all still speak French. And a lot of the software that's used, they buy from French software corporations. So the colonialism still exists, right? It's not, the space of it changes, right? But it's still, yeah. I hope I answered anything, said anything relevant to what you were interested in there.
Yeah, I just needed your confirmation that I'm on the right path, understanding.
Yeah, what you said was very coherent.
Okay, that's all I needed. Thank you.
No, you're more than welcome. Thanks for letting me talk so long. Alrighty then. Well, I think on that note, we'll bring this discussion to a close. And thanks for you guys. Thanks for being here, everyone. And anybody who's watching this, if you want to leave comments on the YouTube chat, do so. There'll also be instructions on where else you can leave comments or send emails if you like. Until then, have a good day, have a good evening, and we'll see you next time.